In 1829, Andrew Jackson was inaugurated president, and Washington, D.C. almost died of shock at the events that surrounded the inauguration. American presidents had been inaugurated since George Washington took the oath of office as the first president, but no inauguration had ever looked like Jackson's inauguration. A crowd of some 10,000 people, out-of-towners, mostly from the American West, descended on Washington. Andrew Jackson was their champion. They wanted to make sure that Jackson was safely inaugurated. They had their reasons, or at least they thought they had their reasons, for being suspicious of those people who might bar the door to Jackson. Jackson had run for president in 1824, and although he had received the most popular votes and the most electoral votes, he did not receive a majority of the electoral votes, and so, under the authority of the Constitution, the race went to the House of Representatives, where Jackson lost to John Quincy Adams. Jackson's followers resented the outcome of that 1824 election. Many of them felt that the election had been stolen. They thought that the powers that be, the elites who were entrenched in Washington, had deprived their champion, their hero, of his right to be president, of their right to have their votes counted, and their favorite become president of the United States. They mobilized. They didn't do anything overtly in 1825 when John Quincy Adams was inaugurated president, but they mobilized politically for the next election. And in 1828, Andrew Jackson won handily. This time around, his followers decided that there would be no doubt that their man had won. And so they came to Washington. In the eyes of the people who lived in Washington, Washington, D.C. in those days was not the great world city that it is today. It was really a small village in the forests at the border between Maryland and Virginia. Actually, it was entirely on the Maryland side, but the District of Columbia had been carved out of the two states. And it was a place where people went when Congress was in session, because Congress was in session by no means all the time. Congress would be in session, and so the members of Congress would come. Some would bring their families, but clerks, lobbyists, people who had business with Congress would come at that time. There were a comparatively small number of permanent residents, and the permanent residents were people who worked for the federal government. These were people who had permanent jobs in the post office department, in the War Department, in the other agencies of the federal government, and their families, and the shopkeepers, and the doctors, and the barbers, and the other people who were needed to support a community of that size. But it was a relatively small community, and these people considered themselves to be sort of the keepers of the conscience, the keepers of the government. And when they saw in 1829 this dirty rabble that had come to install Andrew Jackson as president, they were appalled. What is the world coming to? What is the American government coming to? What is, and this is the critical point, what is democracy coming to? The 1820s in America saw the emergence of democracy as both a powerful force in American politics and also the defining characteristic of America's version of republicanism. A reminder, a republic with a small r is a system of government, it is a state, in which political power rests upon the people. But republics allow people to actually exercise political power in different ways. Some are pure democracies, where ordinary people vote on the laws that are going to govern them. In most systems that are larger than, say, a city or a small town, they are representative republics. And so people vote for representatives, for people who will, well, in the American case, serve in Congress, hold positions in the Senate, and who will themselves make the decisions for the United States. When the United States was founded, and when its Constitution was written in the 1780s, democracy, the idea that ordinary people should actually exercise political power, was very much a minority opinion. The framers of the Constitution, they wrote a Constitution that was really designed against democracy. Yes, it is true that members of the House of Representatives would be voted upon by ordinary people, or I should say ordinary voters. But ordinary voters in those days were a minority of the population. You had to be, first of all, typically, you had to be an adult, yeah. You had to be male, although in few places women could vote. You pretty much had to be white. There were a few places where African Americans could vote. But most importantly, you had to own property, and you had to have been resident where you lived for a substantial length of time. So they didn't want people just passing through. There was a real reluctance to hand political power over to ordinary people. And the Senate was chosen not even by the people of the states. The Senate was chosen, members of the Senate were chosen by the state legislatures, who acted as a filter. And the president was chosen by electors, who were in many cases chosen by the legislatures of the state. So there was this real reluctance to let ordinary people actually participate in politics. But by the 1820s, most of those reservations had gone away, and ordinary people could actually exercise political power. Now again, these ordinary people are not everybody by any means. Women, again, pretty much can't vote. Black people can't vote. But if you were an adult white male, you no longer had to own a certain amount of property. You no longer had to be 15 years in residence or something like that in your state. So ordinary farmers, ordinary blacksmiths, ordinary shopkeepers could vote. And in their first opportunity, they voted for Andrew Jackson, the first ordinary person to become president of the United States. And they voted for him once, and somehow he got shut out of the office. So they voted for him the second time, and this time he did get elected. And they came, as I say, around 10,000 people or so descended on Washington. And they listened from the outskirts of the crowd when Jackson gave his inaugural address. But then they went to the White House, the president's residence, the executive mansion, as it was usually called then, even though it was as white then as it is now in terms of paint and all that. And they went to a reception that he hosted at the White House. And these thousands of people, they jammed into the White House. In fact, they pressed so hard into the White House that they backed Jackson up against a wall until he was nearly crushed. And he had to slip out the back in order not to be crushed to death. They tried to come in the front doors. The front doors were wide open, but the lines in the doors were too great, so they came in the windows. They jammed up against the punch bowls. They broke the punch bowls. They trampled the curtains. They made a mess of the place. And by the time the reception was over, it looked like an invading army had been through. And as I say, the longtime residents of Washington, they just could not get over this. Is this what democracy is about? These ordinary people, these people who are not well educated, if educated at all, these people who really don't have the kind of stake in the society and the economy that people with property have, is this what happens when you let ordinary people vote? And the answer was, well, yeah, in this particular case. Now, when Jackson took office, Jackson himself, he had been born ordinary, and he'd grown up he was orphaned by the time he was in his teens. And what he accomplished in the world, he accomplished through dint of hard effort and a fighting spirit. But Jackson was a gentleman by acquisition. He was well-mannered. He was relatively wealthy as things went in those days. And so he by no means shared the rough manners of those people who voted for him, but he did share many of their ideas. And at the center of his approach to politics, his understanding of government was that the people should rule. Ordinary people should govern the country. And this appeared in some of Jackson's early decisions. Jackson, as president, headed the executive branch of the government. And in the executive branch, there are, well, the president and vice president, but those are the only two elected members of the executive branch. All the other members of the executive branch are appointed. They're basically hired by the president. And Jackson, he swept through the executive branch and swept out many people who had held their jobs for years, for decades, under the previous administrations. Now, those people who lost their jobs, they complained very loudly. And they called it the spoils system, under the principle that to the victor goes the spoils. That is, your side wins, you get to put your own people in office. And most of them criticized this spoils system because it showed that, well, people who had become expert in their jobs, people who had learned what it meant to levy and to collect taxes and to run the post office and to pay for the Navy and to do all the stuff that a government needs to do. You don't just know this stuff by instinct, you have to learn it. And all this expertise was going out the window. Jackson was unrepentant. Jackson took the position, as he stated in a public message, he said, the jobs of government are not, he didn't put it quite this way, but he said it's not rocket science. And any person of ordinary intelligence and diligence can learn to do these jobs. And furthermore, government jobs are not something that anybody owns. Even if you've been in the job for 6, 8, 10 years, the job is not yours. The job is that of the people of the United States. And it's a good idea to rotate those jobs. So Jackson preferred the term rotation in office to the spoils system. But the idea was that the people had spoken, and the people had chosen Andrew Jackson, and Andrew Jackson was going to choose people he wanted, people he liked, people he trusted. Now, to borrow a term from a much later date, Jackson was concerned at the potential existence of, well, I hesitate to use the term because it's overused today, but of a deep state, of people who considered that they were above the reach of voters, that they knew better how to run the government than voters did. And Jackson said, no, in a democracy, the voters are the ones who know how to run the government. Now, it's true they might not be so expert as people who've been in the job for long, but they're less likely to be corrupt, to have been corrupted by dealings with, let's say, if you're a provisioner to the War Department, if you sell stuff to the War Department, suppose you slip a bribe to the clerk in the War Department who has to approve contracts. Well, a relationship develops, and this is good for the provisioner, this is good for the clerk, but it's not good for the public. And so, said Jackson, there has to be this house cleaning every so often to get fresh blood, and furthermore, simply to give other people a chance to benefit from these government jobs. Now, some of the jobs were in Washington, but most of the jobs were actually in branches of the post office all around the country. And postmasterships in cities and towns around the country were the largest portion of federal employment. And Jackson thought that, okay, my side, my party, it's not yet called the Democratic Party, but it will be called the Democratic Party soon, that my party won, and therefore my party ought to get the benefit of the victory. So, this was an early example. This was an early example of what would be called populism. Populism is a term that's often used somewhat disparagingly as referring to a variety of things. Usually at its heart, it means a protest or an uprising of people who consider themselves sort of ordinary people, the real people of America, if we're focusing on America, the real people of America against entrenched elites, against know-it-alls who've been in government, in some ways have corrupted or perverted the government in their direction. So Jackson's election and the emergence of Jacksonian democracy in the 1820s and 1830s was an early example, an early illustration of this populist spirit. And again, this populist spirit basically says that we, and the we is often left vague, but we means we ordinary people, we real Americans, need to take or take back control of the government. Now, in the case of Jackson and his voters, the government until then, the presidency in particular, then had been in the control of, well, George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, John Quincy Adams. So you got this so-called Virginia dynasty, these rich Virginia guys, and then the two Adamses, who were lawyers from Massachusetts. And that's a pretty elite bunch. Jackson is the first one to break the hold of this aristocracy in American life. And so, because the policies they wanted often tilted against the elites, against the entrenched property interests, they were seen as a threat by those property interests. Now, leaving aside one's own property interests, there was reason to suspect that Jackson's policies would be misguided, if guided at all. A good example was when Jackson declared war on the Bank of the United States. The Bank of the United States was a forerunner of the modern Federal Reserve. And one could imagine if a president today declared war on the Fed and said, yeah, the Fed's been running American monetary policy for a century, but I don't like the way it's doing it, so we're going to overthrow it. So, in fact, there are calls today for doing exactly that, for putting the United States back on a gold standard and taking away the powers of the Fed over the economy. So, Jackson's era, Jackson's movement, Jackson and his supporters, were an early example of this populist spirit. Now, one of the things about populism is that it runs into trouble by its very success. When it succeeds, then it's pretty hard to run against government if you're the government. So when Jackson was the outsider banging on the doors of the White House, so to speak, in 1824 and then 1828 trying to get in, then it's one thing to say we need to take back control of the government. We need to take control of the government in the name of the people. When Jackson ran for re-election in 1832, he was the government. And he had his people in all these positions. And so the populist spirit thrives on being in opposition. It gets confused should it actually happen to win. And as I say, Jackson himself was less the populist than many of the people who support him. This is often the case as well, because it's the rare sort of uneducated, unsuccessful person, and very often uneducated, unsuccessful people are drawn to populist movements. That's by no means why the populist movements exist, but the populist call is for those people who feel that they're not getting their fair shake. They haven't done well enough when things on the current status quo. So they naturally draw on groups like this. But Jackson wasn't one of them. He had succeeded. But he could say, I have been one of you, and now I'm going to govern in your name. Anyway, so populism, when it succeeds, it usually has a shelf life. It usually goes out of date after a relatively short time. So one of the lingering aspects of Jacksonian populism was a style of campaigning for the presidency. A style that requires candidates to display a common touch, to show that you're just ordinary folks. When George Washington ran for president in 1789, and again when he ran for re-election in 1792, he didn't pretend that he was ordinary folks. He was George Washington, and that was fine. People were quite willing to look up to George Washington and vote for somebody who was better than they were. By Jackson's day, that wasn't so. People wanted to be able to look the president right in the eye and say, I'm as good as you. And so, ever after, when people ran for president, when people run for president, they try to demonstrate that they're just like everybody else, even when they're patently not. And this showed up really early. In 1840, William Henry Harrison ran for president. William Henry Harrison his family went back to the very earliest days of the so-called First Families of Virginia. And he was born in a mansion in Virginia, and he liked French food and drank fine wine and all this stuff. But his campaign managers ran him on a platform, the so-called a log cabin and hard cider. Law said he was born in a log cabin. He wasn't born in a log cabin. And he didn't drink hard cider. He drank nice wine. But this became mandatory, and you still see it in presidential politics today. Candidates always try to position their opponents as someone who's out of touch with the ordinary people. Okay, Jackson, the first wave of populism. The second wave of populism in America occurs in the 1890s under something called the Populist Party. The formal name was the People's Party, but it was often called the Populist Party. And again, it was a movement among people who felt that government had become out of touch with them and their concerns. It centered on farmers who had been losing out economically in the 1870s, 1880s, early 1890s. by a decline in farm prices, by the rise of the cities, both as economic engines of life and also as the center of attention in American life. Farmers had long thought, American farmers had long thought, that they were the salt of the earth, that the American Republic rested upon them. Thomas Jefferson, a farmer, a pretty rich farmer, he farmed on his plantation at Monticello. He didn't farm, his slaves did the farming. But nonetheless, he identified as a farmer. George Washington, by the way, identified as a farmer too. And Jefferson in particular praised the so-called yeoman farmer, the independent farmer, the person who owned his own farm, as the pillar of the American Republic. And farmers had long thought that's what they were, because after all, you feed the country, and that's a pretty big deal. You have to, everybody has to eat. You don't need to buy the stuff that's made in factories. You can usually get by without that. Humans had gotten by without that stuff for thousands of years. So the farmers felt, first of all, economic disadvantage by the Industrial Revolution. They felt disrespected by the Cultural Revolution that went along with the Industrial Revolution. And so they organized a political party. And this political party adopted the name Peoples, and populist, by the way, is simply the Latin term for peoples. So the People's Party, they called themselves populists. And they campaigned deliberately, distinctly against the powers that be at the time. So they campaigned against Wall Street. They campaigned against big business. They campaigned against banks. They campaigned against railroads. They campaigned against the Republican Party, which was the political party of business, of the banks, of the railroads, and all this stuff. And they had a set of propositions that they were going to employ, if elected, where they would regain control of the government. Populists often look back to an earlier golden age when they were respected. And in many cases, sort of as an individual thing, it coincides with when the individuals complaining were children. And they remember things as simpler and better during their childhood than they are now. Some of this is simply growing up. When you're an 8-year-old kid, what cares do you have? You know, if your parents take care of you, I mean, assuming you have a reasonably safe and secure childhood, then you think, okay, well, that's fine. But you get to be an adult and you have responsibilities of adulthood, and then all of a sudden, boy, the world looks more complicated. So the populists had this whole platform, and they ran political candidates at the state level, in cities, towns, in states. They were strongest in the Farm Belt of America because it was a campaign primarily of farmers. And they had some success. They ran a candidate for president in 1896. Their candidate was William Jennings Bryan, who happened to be also the candidate of the Democratic Party. Now this part is significant because the Populist Party of the 1890s did not succeed as a party. And a principal reason it did not succeed as a party is that third parties in American politics face long odds. It's really hard to get a foothold as a third party in American politics because of the system of government we have, where we don't have proportional representation. In many parliamentary systems, there's a proportional system of voting. So if the Green Party in Germany gets 15% of the vote overall, even if they don't win in any of the particular districts, then they get 15% or some percent of seats in the national parliament. The United States doesn't work like that. You have to actually win in a congressional district to get a single seat. So populists, they didn't elect very many members of Congress, and they really weren't in a position where they could carry enough votes to elect a president. But when the Democrats, the issues that they were campaigning on became so popular among farmers, and farmers were an important part of the Democratic Party, that the Democratic Party itself basically stole many of the Populist Party platform planks, the ideas that the populists proposed. So that when the Democrats nominated William Jennings Bryan, in effect, he was running on a populist platform. And so the Populist Party just said, okay, we'll nominate him too. Now, William Jennings Bryan lost, but the fact that a major party had adopted the agenda of the Populist Party represented a victory for the populists. They didn't win the presidency, but many of their ideas were taken over by the Democratic Party, and in fact, some of them were taken over by the Republican Party as well, and they evolved. The populist movement in America evolved in part into the progressive movement of the early 20th century. And some of the ideas of the populists, like an income tax, a federal income tax, which hadn't existed until then, was something that the populists proposed that the progressives adopted that became law. And the income tax is a major part of American politics today and the American economy. So the populists of the 1890s, they didn't win the presidency, but you might say they won the argument. At least they won the argument on certain important issues. Another wave of populism emerged in the 1980 campaign when Ronald Reagan ran against Jimmy Carter. Now, Ronald Reagan wasn't your model populist by any means. He had been a Hollywood actor. He had been twice elected governor of California, by then the nation's largest state. But he campaigned on the idea that the federal government had gotten too big, that it had gotten out of touch with the American people. Reagan was elected, not entirely because of what he said on those points. The American economy was in bad shape. The United States was suffering reverses in foreign policy. And Jimmy Carter was not a particularly compelling or charismatic candidate. But when Reagan was inaugurated, he was elected in 1980, inaugurated in 1981, in his inaugural address, he articulated a fundamental theme of populism. And he said in his inaugural address that in our current situation, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem itself. And populists have long run against government. And Reagan was distilling their complaint. Government isn't the solution to our problems. And governments had long said, you got problems? We'll solve your problems for you. Reagan was saying, no, no, no. You're not going to solve the problems because you're the problem itself. Now, this was quite striking coming from Ronald Reagan, who, as I say, had been governor of California, and being governor of a big state, you're part of the government, fella. But nonetheless, it resonated with a lot of people in the United States after the 1960s and 1970s. The 1960s, well, actually going all the way back to the 1930s, the New Deal of the 1930s was, among other things, an example of a great expansion of federal responsibility to solve the problems of American life. Until the 1930s, Americans had problems, but they generally did not look to government to solve those problems. In the 1930s, the New Deal, the Democratic Party said the country has problems, the government needs to solve them. Lyndon Johnson's Great Society of the 1960s was based on the same principle. And by the 1970s, Americans, well, they sort of forgotten the advantages of the New Deal and the Great Society, and they could focus on the disadvantages, on things they didn't like about them. There's a tendency in politics for people to ask, what have you done for me lately? And if things have turned bad recently, then they remember those most recent things and often forget the things that have gone before. But anyway, Reagan wins, and he effectively, and he says that government is the problem. And especially the Republican Party, ever since 1980, and at times the Democratic Party, but more often the Republican Party, which for generations had been the party of the status quo. The Republican Party was the party that the populists of the 1890s ran against. It was the party that represented Wall Street and the banks and big business and all that stuff. For the Republican Party under Reagan to adopt the view that government is the problem, well, to some degree it serves the interests of businesses that want to get government out of the way. But it represents sort of this continuing theme, call it a continuing populist undercurrent. We don't like government. Now, Americans in Reagan's time and ever since have been more dependent on government for more things than ever before in history. But one might say, well, that's exactly why this undercurrent remains popular. When Donald Trump ran for the Republican nomination in 2016, and then again when he ran in the general campaign in 2016, he was the most anti-status quo candidate. He was the one telling the rest of the Republican candidates, you guys are too tainted by being part of the Republican, part of the government machine. You need an outsider like me. When he got the nomination and he ran against Hillary Clinton, he branded as emblematic of the status quo. She was part of Clinton Inc. Bill Clinton had been president earlier, now she was running, she'd been Secretary of State and all this other stuff. And so Donald Trump told American voters that if you want to change, if you're tired of government, if you want to make, he didn't use the term populism, but if you want to make this statement where ordinary people should reclaim control of the government, then vote for me. And people did. Not enough, that he would win the popular vote, but enough that he won the electoral vote. And so Donald Trump became president on what we could call sort of the latest wave of populist discontent at the governmental status